Imagine the most important decision you have made in your life. What were the circumstances? Where were you? Were you by yourself? Were you with your family? Would they be affected? Would any loved one be affected? Imagine that. You're about to make the most important decision in your life. Now, can I see the hands of the people who are born after 1962 in this room, please? Okay, most of us. So you might find it particularly interesting this stuff. In 1962, something happened. One man made a decision, a very important decision that still affects all of us in this room. Now, history is filled with people who have made heroic decisions and heroic acts and affected the lives of their armies, their countries, their families, all sorts of things. But when you imagine there are maybe only a handful of people throughout the entire history who have made such decisions that affected the entire population in the world. In 1962, two countries, two superpowers at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union, were in the midst of the Cold War. And on this particular month of October in 1962, something drastic happened. I just learned about this last year, and I am surprised that we don't grow up hearing about this story and about this man and about his decision that he made on particular October day in 1962. What made things even more tense was the fact that when these two countries were in the midst of a Cold War, both of them were possessing nuclear weapons. Both the United States and the Soviet Russia had nuclear weapons in their arsenals. And on this particular month of October in 1962, although there was no military conflict, active military conflict between these two powers, the United States was suspicious that the Soviet Russians were stockpiling the island of Cuba, only 90 miles away from the coast of Florida, with missiles. They couldn't prove it. They asked their ambassadors in the United Nations, they didn't reply. They couldn't prove it, but they were suspicious that this was happening. And they were very afraid. And one day, one of the spy planes of the United States actually photographed those missiles on Cuba. And the entire country was on an instant alert. People started seeking shelters on their desks a couple of times a week for rehearsals, for nuclear attack rehearsals. And following these events, the United States decided to place its own nuclear weapons in two countries, Italy and Turkey. So if something happened on that particular month, the first place that the Soviet Russians would hit was here, Istanbul, and then Italy. When all this was happening, 4 special unit submarines from the Russian Navy were deployed to go to Cuba, from the Arctic waters all the way into Cuba. This whole thing is going to be called in the history as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, when the news of missiles in Cuba broke out, President Kennedy, the US president at the time, ordered a naval blockade around the Cuban island so that no other ships or submarines would pass through that blockade. They wanted to secure that area. And these submarines were already there, undetected. And the US Navy, after a couple of days, finally located these submarines They didn't want to attack them, they didn't want to destroy them, but they started harassing them by dropping what they call depth charges. From the surface of the water, you drop these depth charges, and they go boom on the submarine. And imagine this is happening constantly, like 10 or 20 times a minute. You are in the submarine, you're stuck. You want to go up, you cannot go up. And to make things worse, the submarine officers do not have a connection with their supervisors in Moscow, so they do not know if they are in a state of war with Russia, with the United States or not. While harassing these submarines, what the US Navy did not know was that these submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes. It would be just a matter of split seconds for these submarines to attack the US Navy and vaporize them. Can you imagine what would happen next if this happened?
Istanbul. Whoa.
The US officials at the time already told that if that had happened, the US planes were already ready to attack Moscow, and then the nuclear Armageddon would begin, and we might not even be here today. So what prevented that? Imagine yourself, you're in a submarine, you're being attacked, and you do not know whether you're going to make it alive or not. For all you know, you might be in a state of war. Of the 3 officers on the Soviet submarines, 2 of them decided to launch an attack. The third one, Vasilis Arkhipov, said no. And the Soviet regulations, military regulations required that all 3 officers had to agree on launching an attack. What this person has done, has anyone ever heard of Vasilis Arkhipov before? No. Thank you. What this man has done, has decided not to do, could very well be the only reason why we are here today. After a while, things settled. The Cuban Missile Crisis was finished. They made some agreements to remove their missiles, and then these officers went back home to Moscow. How were they greeted? They were greeted in disgrace. They were told by their superiors that it would be better if you went down with the ships and did not come back. His wife would later on tell that he didn't want to talk about it, and when she wanted to talk more about it, he said, "That's enough, I don't want it." It took the world 40 years after 1962 to understand how close we came to a global destruction. And like I said in the beginning of my speech, I am amazed in a negative way that I did not grow up learning about this story until 1 year ago. That there was this man in this dire situation who said no. So I want to do here today what the world has failed to do in front of you. I would like to praise Vasilis Arkhipov.